My name's Lauren Taylor. I'm 33. When I got engaged to Daniel, the first thing my family said was, "Well, at least you'll marry rich." To them, marrying well meant winning. They had no idea I was already earning more than he was. They didn't know I paid for the ring, or that I bought the house, or that I was the one who asked him to take my last name. Not out of ego, but because after years of being pushed toward the right man, I had built something no one gave me. At our wedding dinner, when the host raised a toast to the Taylors, my mom didn't say a word. Growing up, I was always told I had two options: marry smart or marry rich. Ideally both. My mother said it with a smile, as if it were just advice passed down like a family recipe. But underneath her voice was a warning that love was a luxury, not a necessity. The women in my family were sharp, observant, even clever. But they were also tired of holding families together while pretending their dreams were never real to begin with. So instead of chasing ambition, they were taught to chase men with ambition. And for a while, I pretended I was okay with that too. In high school, I dated the kind of boys my mother approved of. Varsity athletes, sons of lawyers, clean-cut with polished shoes. I knew how to play the game, compliment their future, laugh at the right moments, keep my own successes quiet so they wouldn't feel outshined. But deep down, I was already learning to build small freelance jobs online, late nights figuring out affiliate marketing, YouTube SEO, designing websites for small-town florists who paid in gift cards and gratitude. I wasn't trying to be impressive, I just wanted to not depend on anyone. But no one took it seriously. They called it a phase, a hobby, a cute side hustle. College didn't make things better. I got a scholarship, worked part-time, built a small portfolio of digital work that paid better than most internships. But every Thanksgiving dinner felt like a rerun. My cousins brought home boyfriends with finance degrees, and my aunt would ask if I was still doing that computer thing. There was always this invisible scorecard at family events: who wore what, who drove what, who was about to get married. I didn't rank on any list. I rented a small apartment, wore sneakers to brunch, and still said no to blind dates. I was building something no one could see yet. That made them nervous. By the time I turned 30, I had incorporated my own company. Digital branding, scaled campaigns, real clients, real revenue. But I still kept my wins private. I didn't need applause. I needed freedom. That's when I met Daniel. He was everything my family would have approved of. On paper, MBA, old money, tall, polite. But what they didn't see was the way he looked at me when I talked about work. He listened. He asked questions. He took me seriously. And when he saw the numbers behind my business, he didn't flinch. He respected them. He respected me. The first time I brought him to a family gathering, all eyes were on him. My uncle asked about his last name within minutes. My grandmother assumed I'd quit my computer job once we got married. They were so quick to write a new narrative for me, one where I'd finally achieved something by proximity. I just smiled. It wasn't the first time they tied my worth to someone else's success. It wouldn't be the last. But what they didn't know was that Daniel and I had already had a very different conversation in private about names, legacy, and ownership. So when the engagement happened, I knew what was coming. The smiles, the applause, the quiet relief from relatives who thought I'd finally secured my life. They wrapped their approval like a ribbon around my future. But I wasn't carrying their expectations anymore. I was walking into something I built. And this time, I wasn't shrinking myself to fit their version of what success should look like. The first time I met Daniel's family wasn't part of any plan. There was no dress rehearsal, no perfect script. It happened because of a delayed flight. We were supposed to land late Friday night and head to a hotel downtown before joining his parents for brunch the next day. But the airline rescheduled everything, and suddenly we had 4 hours to kill, and his mother was already preparing dinner, just in case. I agreed to stop by, thinking we'd stay for 30 minutes. I stayed for 3 hours. Their house looked like something out of a lifestyle magazine. Wide glass doors, curated artwork, perfectly folded throws. The kind of place where nothing smells like food, but everything smells expensive. His mom met us in pearls and heels, even though she had no intention of going anywhere. She gave me the kind of hug that's more about posture than affection. His father didn't stand up from the couch, just gave me a firm nod and a once-over that I pretended not to notice. I've sat in 100 client meetings with venture capitalists, but something about this room made me feel like I was 17 again, walking into a country club through the wrong entrance. Daniel didn't notice. He was relaxed. He belonged. This was his terrain. I tried to match the energy: polite, composed, professional but warm. They asked the usual questions. Where did I grow up? What did my parents do? What do I do exactly? And I gave the usual answers. I didn't mention the name of my company, or the quarterly growth numbers, or the campaign that made headlines last month. I just said, I run a digital branding firm. His mother smiled thinly and said, "Oh, so you work from home?" That wasn't a question. I nodded anyway. Somewhere between the wine and dessert, his sister arrived. Younger than us, flashy and overconfident, she clearly had a script for me, one she'd written based on minimal information. She asked if I'd ever considered going back to school for something tangible, like law or finance. I smiled and said no. She laughed like I'd made a joke. That was the first time I realized I wasn't being tested, I was being measured. And I was already marked as a footnote. Daniel, bless him, didn't pick up on any of it. He was too busy catching up with his dad, talking golf swings and startup news. I sat with his mom and sister, nodding as they talked about fundraisers and destination weddings. I felt like a ghost at my own engagement party. Not invisible, just see-through. Assumed, categorized, dismissed. All because I didn't walk in wearing someone else's last name or job title like a trophy. When we finally left, I said thank you and smiled, as if nothing had touched me. In the car, Daniel said, "That went well, right?" I looked out the window and said yes. It wasn't a lie. It went exactly how I expected. What they didn't expect, and what Daniel didn't know yet, was that I never walked into a room empty-handed. I already knew how to play the long game. I didn't need their approval. I just needed time. That night, back in the hotel, while Daniel slept, I opened my laptop. Not out of spite or pride, but instinct. I had 3 client proposals to send and a final draft to polish. I didn't pause. I didn't doubt. Because no matter how they saw me that evening, I knew exactly who I was. And eventually, so would they. It was a simple envelope. Cream-colored, thick paper, my name printed in gold. Inside, there was an invitation handwritten, no less from Daniel's family, inviting us to a weekend gathering at the lake house. Only, my name had been crossed out. Not scribbled, not angrily slashed, just delicately removed. As if someone had started writing it and then remembered it didn't belong. His mother's handwriting was still visible underneath the line, faint but unmistakable. Daniel didn't notice it first. He read the card, tossed it onto the counter, and said, "Should be fun, right?" I didn't answer. I just stared at the line that had been drawn through my name. Clean, polite, erasing. We'd been together a year. We lived in the same apartment, shared groceries, paid rent. I'd built a wall of client files in the closet and taken meetings from our kitchen island. I even helped Daniel redesign his own company's pitch deck. I wasn't just in his life. I was part of it. But to his family, I was still an accessory. Optional. Replaceable. Cross-outable. At dinner that night, I asked him about it. Not accusing, just curious. He blinked, confused, and said, "I'm sure it was a mistake." But I knew better. I'd worked in branding too long not to know the power of placement, the psychology of paper, the unspoken messages in design. A missing name was never a mistake. It was a signal. A few days later, Daniel's sister posted photos from the lake house on Instagram. Long tables, linen napkins, candles and glass holders. Everyone was dressed in coordinated pastels. The caption read, "Family only." I didn't comment. I didn't like the photo. But I looked at it longer than I should have, letting the familiar tightness build behind my ribs. It wasn't the exclusion that hurt. Not really. It was the erasure. The quiet revision of history that others wouldn't even notice. When people asked who Daniel was dating, they'd say, "Oh, I think he's seeing someone," as if I were a rumor. As if I hadn't spent hours folding his laundry, staying up late to help him polish grant applications, or making dinner while his phone buzzed with Slack notifications. I was real. I was there. I was building my own empire one contract at a time, and yet, to them, I wasn't even worth ink. I started noticing other erasures, family group chats I wasn't added to, invitations that came addressed only to him. Even when I came along, they introduced me as Daniel's friend. Not partner, not girlfriend. One afternoon, his aunt asked me what I did for fun. Not work, not career, just hobbies. I told her I liked designing digital workflows for remote teams. She nodded blankly and said, "Oh, so you're creative." By then, I had 6 retainer clients, 2 junior staff members, and a contract negotiation pending with a startup that would soon go public. But none of that lived in their world. To them, I was just a girl with a laptop. Disposable, sweet, background. It was a strange feeling knowing I could afford more than half the people in that lake house, knowing I had more control over my time, my money, my future, than most of them. And still being treated like an afterthought. The irony wasn't lost on me. I didn't confront them. I didn't ask for my name to be written again. I just went back to work. Every skipped invite became fuel. Every backhanded compliment pushed me forward. I poured myself into the business with a kind of quiet fury. Every client success, every deal closed, every dollar earned became another invisible line I drew not through my name but under it, a signature of presence. A reminder that I was not waiting for a seat at their table. I was building my own. Eventually, I stopped checking Daniel's family posts. I stopped asking about the next trip. I didn't need to be invited. Because I knew what was coming. They could erase my name from paper, but they couldn't erase what I was creating, something bigger, bolder, and undeniable. And one day, that erasure would come back to haunt them, not me. It started with a missed call from my mother. Then another. I ignored both. I knew exactly what she wanted to talk about, and I wasn't ready to play my usual part in the same tired play. But on the 3rd attempt, I answered. Her voice came through with the kind of brightness that's too forced to be real, the kind people use when they're trying to keep things light before bringing up something heavy. She asked if I'd finalized the wedding date. I said no, that was true. We'd set a month and a city, but not a day. I was still balancing launch timelines, partnership meetings, and international travel. But I knew that's not what she was really calling about. I could hear the hesitation thickening the air between her words. Then, like a cracked dam giving way, it came out. "Your aunt wanted to know, what name will you be using?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know. I had known for months. But because I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of thinking I was waiting for permission. I said, "Finally, I'll be keeping mine." There was a pause, not long, but long enough for me to imagine her sitting on the same velvet chair in her sunroom, staring at her nails, considering how best to respond without sounding too disappointed. Then came the laugh, not a joyful one, but that familiar condescending chuckle she reserved for when I did something silly, like choosing business over a bridal shower, or saying no to a family photo where I was supposed to stand behind Daniel. "Oh, honey," she said, "you're making a statement." As if it wasn't a decision. As if it was rebellion. Maybe it was. But it wasn't about pride. Not really. It was about something deeper. Older. I had spent my entire life folding myself into corners of conversations, into smaller boxes of expectations, shrinking my success into bite-sized pieces they could swallow without choking. My name was the only thing that hadn't been revised by them. It was the name I built every invoice under, the name that appeared on incorporation papers, on keynote speaker lists, on TEDx stages, and Forbes write-ups. It was mine. Not shared, not borrowed, mine. I thought about how often women in my family had traded their names like old clothes worn until they faded, then tossed for a new label stitched by someone else. I remembered my aunt, who once had a photography studio under her maiden name, now going by Mrs. Caldwell on Facebook, and referring to her creative years as that little project. I remembered my cousin, who dropped out of grad school to follow her fiancé to another state, saying, "He's the real breadwinner anyway." My mother had done it too. She used to sign holiday cards, Mary Davis, with a looping signature. Now it was just, Mom, or, if pressed, Mrs. David Reeves. No trace of herself except through us, and we weren't much for keeping records. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became. Keeping my name wasn't a protest, it was preservation. Of effort, of self, of a legacy I was still writing in real time. Daniel had never questioned it. When we discussed it early on, he simply nodded and said, "Your name built your company, why change it?" No ego, no games, just clarity. It was one of the reasons I said yes when he proposed. But I knew his family wouldn't see it that way, and neither would mine. A woman keeping her name was still a signal to them, at least. A warning flare, an act of quiet disobedience in a system that expected quiet submission. The next day, I got an email from my grandmother. She had apparently heard the news. It was brief. 2 lines, no greeting. Hard to build a future when you won't let go of the past. Hope you rethink it before the invites go out. I didn't reply. Instead, I called the stationery studio and confirmed the final design. The invitation would say, Caroline Blake and Daniel Ayers. No, Mrs. No, to be wed. No merging. 2 people, equal footing, 2 names. And if anyone couldn't understand that, they could decline the RSVP. Because this time, I wasn't waiting for the family line to approve of mine. I was drawing a new one. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be a warm-up, an easy night of clinking glasses, familiar smiles, and gentle stories before the main event. But as I sat there, listening to voices overlap with laughter and wine, I could feel the old weight of expectation trying to settle over my shoulders again. It was subtle at first, an extra glance from an uncle who never quite learned how to talk to me unless it was about someone else's success. A tight-lipped smile from my aunt when she saw that the seating chart had Daniel's family and mine blended together, not separated by lineage like it was some kind of royal court. The restaurant we'd booked was one I'd invested in during the pandemic. At the time it was weeks from closing, I'd offered quiet backing, a loan that turned into equity, and watched it become one of the most sought-after dining spots in the city. No one at the table that night seemed to know I'd had anything to do with its resurrection. They only knew it was nice and probably expensive, which to them meant Daniel must have picked it. I didn't correct them. I wasn't here to convince anyone anymore. What I hadn't anticipated was the moment they brought out the mic. One of Daniel's cousins, always the enthusiastic type, decided we should go around and share toasts. Impromptu tributes, she called them. One by one, people stood, chuckled through stories, offered generic praise, and made soft jabs about how marriage was the real job. When it got to my mother, I felt my stomach tighten. She stood slowly, adjusted her bracelet, and began with a tone I knew too well, soft, but performative. She spoke about how proud she was, about how she'd always known I was headstrong, how I was different from the other girls in the family. It wasn't a compliment, it was a reminder. A gentle scolding laced with sugar. She told a story from when I was 6, when I'd written my full name across the inside cover of every book in the house, declaring that, if I read it, it's mine. Everyone laughed. I didn't. She ended her toast by saying how grateful she was that I'd found someone like Daniel, someone to balance me out. The room clapped politely. I didn't move. Daniel stood next. He kept it short. He didn't talk about me as a project or as a lesson or as a girl who needed balance. He just said he admired me, that I made him better, that choosing me was the easiest decision of his life. His words were simple, but they landed like thunder. They made the others sound hollow. Then someone passed the mic to me. I didn't reach for it right away. I looked around the room. At the polished table, the flicker of candlelight bouncing off glasses, the sea of half-familiar faces waiting for me to step into a mold they'd cast without asking. I thought about all the times I'd taken mics in other rooms, boardrooms, conferences, interviews, and how none of those had felt half as loaded as this dinner of 50. I took the mic. Then I set it down, gently, deliberately. I stood, smiled, and raised my glass without a word. Silence followed, long enough for people to shift, murmur, wonder if I was going to speak after all. I didn't. That silence was my toast. It said everything. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing. Let them fill in the blanks. Let them sit with their assumptions and wonder if maybe they were wrong about you all along. Let them squirm in the quiet where your voice used to explain itself. When I sat down, Daniel reached for my hand and squeezed it once. That was all I needed. I hadn't folded, I hadn't bowed. I had stood in a room full of people who thought they knew who I was and reminded them that I didn't need to perform to deserve my place. My silence echoed longer than their words ever would. There's a kind of satisfaction that doesn't come from applause or validation. It comes from paper. Crisp, official, numbered, dated. A paper trail with your name on it, signed and sealed and confirmed. For me, that was how it all began to feel real. Not the ring, not the dress fittings, not the venue walkthroughs. It was the invoices. Months before the wedding, while everyone assumed Daniel's family was footing the bill, or worse, that Daniel himself was the actual paperwork, told a different story. The florist, my contact, the 5-figure catering deposit, pulled directly from my business account. The down payment on the vineyard, where we'd be married, wire transfer confirmation sitting in my inbox, line after line, document after document, proof of ownership, of investment, of agency. I didn't hide any of it, but I didn't parade it either. Let them think what they want, I told myself. Let them believe I was just along for the ride. Because the real difference wasn't in what they assumed it was, in what I knew. When the wedding planner first sent over the estimate spreadsheet, I'd looked it over like a CEO reviewing an investment portfolio. I flagged the overages, questioned the margins, optimized where necessary. I didn't want extravagance for extravagance's sake. I wanted elegance, clarity, precision. A day that reflected us well, mostly me. Because Daniel, for all his charm and kindness, had happily deferred most decisions to me. He trusted my taste. He knew I had vision. He didn't need to play the role of the groom in charge. Still, whenever vendors asked about, quote, the family paying, or said something like, your fiancé will get the receipt, I felt the same flicker of annoyance. No, I wanted to say. It's going to me. I'm the one signing. I remember sitting in my office one Thursday evening, the city just beginning to glow outside my window, and reviewing the final invoice from the event team. It was a big number. A 5-figure closeout. My assistant came in to drop off a contract draft for another deal, paused when she saw the email on my screen, and said, "Is that the wedding?" I nodded. She grinned. "Damn, you're really doing this all yourself?" I nodded again, but slower. It wasn't about pride, it was about choice. I had chosen to pay, to build, to lead. Just like I always had. This wedding wasn't the first thing I'd built from scratch. It was just the first thing everyone else would see. The next week, the stationery vendor called to confirm the return address on the thank you notes. They asked if I wanted to use Daniel's last name already, to match his family crest. I laughed out loud. No, I told them, my voice firm. Use my name. Use my company address. That pause on the other end of the line told me everything. Even the printer had assumed. I didn't blame them. But I wasn't bending either. What surprised me most, though, was how good it felt to finally lean into the facts. To not correct assumptions out loud, but to simply let the systems and logistics do it for me. In the end, no one could argue with the name on the account, the email on the invoice, the wire confirmation with my initials. I started forwarding those emails to a folder labeled Simply Proof. I don't know why. Maybe I thought someday someone would challenge it. Or maybe I just liked having it all in one place, a silent archive of every decision, every bill, every payment I had handled, while everyone else thought I was just choosing napkin colors. And then came the wine list. Daniel's uncle had offered to take care of the drinks, and I thanked him, gently declining. He didn't protest, but I saw the look, the one that said I was overstepping, that maybe I should let the men handle the alcohol while I picked out flowers. I smiled and let him talk, but the next day I called the vineyard myself and added a reserve crate to our order. Signed. Paid. Delivered. Weeks later, during a family brunch, Daniel's cousin asked if we were getting any help from my side of the family. I said no. She gave a sympathetic look and said, "Oh, that must be hard." I almost laughed. Hard? No. What had been hard was pretending all these years that I was waiting for permission, for funding, for rescue. Now I had something better. I had receipts. The dress fitting was the only part of the wedding prep that made me feel like I was walking through someone else's life. I stood in front of a full-length mirror, wrapped in layers of white silk, and thought not for the first time that I looked like someone in costume. Not because I didn't love Daniel. I did, but because this version of me, the one everyone expected to see walking down the aisle, wasn't the version that had built a company from scratch, or signed contracts at midnight, or read profit and loss statements over coffee. She was softer, quieter, ornamental. And that wasn't me. Still, I played the role. I smiled during bridal showers. I let people gush over the ring. I nodded politely at assumptions that the wedding was a joint financial effort between two families, even though my name was the only one on the checks. I played the part of the grateful bride. And in that quiet performance, I started to feel my own power. There is a strange kind of strength in not correcting people, in letting them speak while knowing the truth lives in your silence. I didn't need to announce who paid for the venue. I didn't need to clarify whose Amex card covered the flowers or the string quartet or the branded welcome gifts for guests. I just kept signing, kept sending, kept approving. I let the assumptions flow around me like wine through a house with strong foundations. And I stayed standing. One afternoon, Daniel's aunt pulled me aside after brunch and offered unsolicited advice about staying humble when you marry into a family with status. She meant well, I think. But I remember looking at her and wondering how many people at this wedding thought I was marrying up, as if I hadn't already been somewhere above for a while now, quietly, without a banner, without a husband's name to legitimize it. I didn't correct her, I just smiled. Later that night, I opened my laptop and finalized another quarterly deal that would add 6 figures to our year-end. I signed the document while still wearing the engagement dress she had complimented that morning. Every woman who has ever been underestimated, knows the temptation to prove a point out loud, to list your wins, your numbers, your battle scars. But I was past that now. I didn't need to prove, I just needed to keep building. There was one moment, though, that nearly broke the performance. At the final rehearsal dinner, one of Daniel's cousins stood to toast. He said I had such a calming presence and praised my ability to make Daniel's life easier. Everyone clapped. I sat there, holding my wine glass, smiling like the role demanded. But I wasn't calm. Inside, I was vibrating with every email I had sent, every sleepless night budgeting the wedding, every business call I had taken between cake tastings and dress fittings. I wasn't calm, I was composed. There's a difference, and only one of them comes from power. After the toast, Daniel leaned over and whispered, "That was sweet, right?" I nodded. Because it was. And yet, in that moment, I knew he didn't see the disconnect. Not yet, but he would. The thing about playing a role is that, eventually, you stop pretending. The act becomes the truth, not because you change, but because you shape the world around you until it reflects your reality. I didn't need applause, I needed space. And I was creating it, one silent decision at a time. It was the morning before our wedding when I got the final draft of the licensing deal. The timing was almost poetic. While everyone around me was buzzing about centerpieces and guest lists, I was opening a PDF with 7 digits in the top right corner, and my name listed above the signature line. It was a culmination of months of behind-the-scenes negotiation, quiet flights, Zoom calls in hotel bathrooms, and whispered approvals while someone adjusted a veil or pinned a dress hem. I hadn't told anyone about the deal. Not Daniel, not my friends, definitely not his family. It felt like something sacred, something fully mine, in a time when every other detail of my life was being picked over, filtered through opinions and expectations. This moment was untouched. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, laptop open on my knees, sunlight leaking through cream-colored curtains, and I signed. One signature. That was it. Quiet, small, unceremonious, but I knew what it meant. My attorney sent a thumbs-up emoji 5 minutes later. "We're officially live." I smiled and closed my laptop. It was a moment of stillness, but also of ownership. Because while the rest of the world saw a bride putting on makeup for someone else's last name, I was putting the finishing stroke on something I built from scratch. I wasn't just entering a marriage, I was walking into a new fiscal quarter with more power than ever. Later that afternoon, during a final run-through with the planner, someone asked about name cards for the dinner table. They had printed Mrs. Melissa Carter. I asked if it could be changed to Melissa Davis. She paused. "But you're taking his name, right?" I said no, kindly. She looked puzzled but nodded. I didn't need to explain. Let them assume. Let the monogrammed napkins lie. Let the invitations live in someone else's scrapbook. That name wasn't mine. Not anymore. It never was. Melissa Davis had signed the contract. Melissa Davis had earned the deal. And Melissa Davis was the name that would headline the next article in Forbes' Under 35 list if I said yes to that feature. I hadn't decided yet. That night, I had dinner alone in my room, not out of sadness or nerves, but out of something else, something like reverence. I ordered room service and toasted myself with champagne, the real kind, the expensive kind. Not because it was my wedding weekend, but because I had just closed the biggest deal of my career, and no one would even think to ask how I'd pulled it off. They'd assume Daniel helped, that his network opened doors, that his support gave me wings. And I would smile. Again. Because I knew that every door I'd walked through, I'd knocked on first. Every wing I'd built, I'd tested in storms. Alone. At one point, I looked down at my ring. It was beautiful, tasteful, a symbol of love I didn't question. But I realized something everyone had asked about: the ring, the proposal, the dress. No one had asked about my company, or my newest hire, or the third office I was quietly opening in Chicago. And that was fine, because while they would remember the wedding, I would remember the signature, the one that changed everything, and didn't require anyone's approval but mine. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, there were countless questions, but none of the ones that mattered. People asked about my dress, about the guest list, about the seating arrangements. They asked if the cake would be vanilla or lemon, if Daniel would cry at the altar, if I'd written my vows. They asked if I was nervous, if I was ready, if I was sure. No one asked about the expansion plans I had for the firm. No one asked about the call I had taken at 6 a.m. the day before from our investors in Berlin. No one asked what I was walking away from or walking into when I said, "I do." It wasn't their fault, really. They simply couldn't see the part of me that didn't fit inside their frame. The girl who used to get straight A's, who built her business out of a laptop in cafes between night shifts, who once stood outside an office building in the snow just to hand someone a proposal they never read. That part of me was invisible in lace and soft lighting. People love a love story. They don't always know how to see the empire being run in the background. I kept waiting for anyone to pull me aside and ask, "How are you really doing?" Not about Daniel, not about the floral arrangements, but about me, my name, my plans, my signature on things no one would ever frame. I waited for someone to notice the part of me that hadn't stopped working, not even for a second, even while I was walking through final fittings and brunches and long-lost cousins awkwardly asking how we met. Instead, I smiled. I answered every question as expected. I played the role, and maybe I even played it well. Daniel never once asked me to shrink, that's the truth. He admired me, genuinely, and he celebrated every win. But sometimes even love can't hold a mirror up to you when the room is full of noise. And in that noise, something began to ache. I wasn't sad, I wasn't second-guessing, but I felt this hollowness whenever someone said, "You're going to make such a beautiful wife," as if that title alone was the finish line. They didn't know about the trademark filing I had submitted the same week we ordered the cake. They didn't know that our honeymoon destination had also been the site of a potential investor summit, one I'd quietly arranged behind the scenes, just in case. My mother, God bless her, beamed with pride, but even she couldn't hide the relief in her voice when she told her friends, "Melissa finally found someone to take care of her." I didn't correct her. I never do. What would I say? Actually, I've been taking care of myself since 19? Actually, I make more than he does? Actually, the prenup favors me? There's a certain kind of woman who learns to smile instead of speak, who learns that her silence makes people more comfortable than her truth. I had become fluent in that language. I knew how to dim myself just enough to let the moment shine. But inside, I was burning. I remember one night, 2 days before the wedding, I stepped out onto the balcony of my suite, just to breathe. The city lights stretched like veins across the horizon. Somewhere below, someone was arguing over a check, or falling in love, or quitting a job. Life was pulsing on without ceremony. And I thought, they'll never know how much I gave up just to keep being seen as enough. Because that's the thing, it wasn't just about money. It wasn't about power. It was about recognition. About the 1,000 unasked questions that held all the answers to who I truly was. And I knew, as I stood there alone in the wind, that I would spend the rest of my life answering them for myself, even if no one else ever thought to ask. The reception was everything they expected, and nothing like they imagined. The venue was a renovated art gallery I had quietly invested in 6 months earlier. It was sleek, minimalist, with exposed brick and warm lighting. Every detail had been curated with precision, down to the matte black silverware and the string quartet playing a reimagined version of Radiohead between speeches. People kept complimenting my taste, as if elegance had happened by accident. They didn't know that I had selected the wine from a supplier I backed, or that the centerpieces were made by a floral studio I'd helped launch. Throughout the night, I played the role they assigned me. The graceful bride. The glowing woman with nothing left to prove. I accepted compliments with a nod and a thank you, laughing at the right moments, stepping aside when Daniel's uncle decided to tell the same story for the third time. I made sure my smile didn't drop even when I overheard someone say, "She's lucky she married well." It didn't sting the way it used to. Not anymore. Because I had made peace with the fact that most people can't see past their own reflection. They need you to stay within their frame to feel comfortable. If you outgrow it, they'll either shrink you or squint in confusion. And tonight, I didn't shrink, I just kept moving. One of the waiters, a college intern I had met during a leadership workshop, slipped me a folded note when I passed the kitchen. "You inspire me," it read. "Someday I'll build something like this too." I folded it and tucked it inside my clutch. That moment meant more than any toast. The speeches came and went. My mother cried during hers. And Daniel's father told a slightly inappropriate joke about finally marrying her off, which earned a few awkward laughs. Daniel, sweet and sincere, thanked everyone for supporting us. Then he turned toward me, raised his glass, and said, "Melissa taught me what vision looks like. She made me believe in more." It was short, simple, but the weight of it landed. Later, while people danced under strings of lights and buzzed with champagne, I walked out to the terrace. The city pulsed beneath us. Daniel joined me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders, resting his chin on my head. "They love you," he whispered. I smiled but didn't answer, because the truth was, I hadn't done any of this for love. Not for theirs, anyway. I had done it for the girl. I used to be the one who was told to tone it down, to stop making lists, to let the man lead. I had done it for every time I swallowed my voice to make space for someone else's ego. I had done it for the silence I endured, for the doubt I buried, for the times I succeeded in secret because celebration felt too loud for the room I was in. That night, I danced too, not because it was expected, but because I wanted to. I danced with my friends, with my team who had flown in from 3 cities, with Daniel, who looked at me like I was made of stars. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was performing. I felt present, entire, not someone's wife, not someone's story, just me. The playlist ended with Nina Simone. I didn't plan it, but I smiled when it started. It's a new dawn, it's a new day. And as the last note played, I knew that this evening, this perfect, deliberate, unapologetic evening, wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about living exactly as I was, with nothing left to shrink. When the last guest left and the catering staff began clearing glasses and folding napkins, I stepped into the quiet that followed the applause. The space that just an hour ago echoed with polite laughter and clinking forks was now still. Daniel was inside changing out of his tux jacket, and I stood in the middle of the reception hall, still in my heels, still holding the bouquet that had outlasted the last toast. I didn't feel the need to say anything clever. There were no final words to deliver, no grand statements about love or success, just breath, just presence. There was a time when I thought vindication needed a microphone. That to be heard, I'd have to spell out every way I had been doubted, erased, overlooked. That I'd need to sit across from every person who ever said, "She's too much," and explain that too much was exactly what built everything they saw. But standing there now, with the room cleared and the lights dimmed, I felt something deeper. I didn't need to say a word because the room had already spoken for me. They saw the signature on the vendor contracts. They saw the production credits discreetly listed on the back of the program. They noticed that every plate, every stem of eucalyptus, every decision from the imported linens to the seating flow had a purpose. My purpose. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't a campaign to earn their admiration. It was just mine, built without apology. Earlier in the evening, I caught a cousin whispering to another guest. I thought she was going to keep her name. "She's the one with the company, right?" And the guest, someone I didn't even know well, said simply, "She's the brand." It was quiet, unintended for me, but I heard it. And it sat with me the whole night, not because I needed the validation, but because it confirmed something I had only recently begun to believe. That being the brand didn't require a slogan. That authority could be silent. That legacy didn't always wear a crown. It could wear heels and hold space without asking permission. There were no speeches left to give. I had said everything I needed to through the structure of the evening, the rhythm of the logistics, the feeling people left with. Daniel returned with no tie and a half smile, asking if I wanted to help with the final walkthrough. He knew I would say yes. He knew I'd want to make sure the crew got tipped properly, that the table rentals were logged, that the invoice was closed the way I liked it, clean, accurate, with nothing left hanging. Because I don't leave things hanging. I close chapters. I tie ribbons. I exit fully. I remember when someone once said to me, "You act like you're always preparing for a TED Talk." They meant it as a jab, that I was too intentional, too polished. But the truth is, I no longer want to explain why I plan deeply, speak selectively, or move precisely. I no longer need to justify why I decline some dinners, or prefer emails over phone calls. I no longer shape myself to be digestible. I'm not a soundbite. I'm a system. And I've learned that the more whole you become, the fewer explanations you owe. That night there were no rehearsed lines, no clever comebacks, just silence and structure. Just the sound of decisions clicking into place. The only thing louder than the music was what remained after it stopped. The impression, the weight, the undeniable architecture of something deliberately built. When we walked out of the hall, locking it behind us, the air was cool and still. My heels clicked against the pavement in rhythm with Daniel's steps. He looked at me, eyes soft. I looked ahead. No one needed reminding of who I was. They had just spent an entire evening living inside the answer. The morning after the wedding, I woke up before the light changed color through the blinds. The room was still, quiet in a way that only comes after something big, after the crescendo, after the lights go down, after the clapping fades. Daniel was still asleep, one arm tucked under the pillow, the other resting on my waist like an anchor. I eased out gently, pulled on the robe with my initials stitched into the cuff, and walked barefoot into the kitchen of our suite. There was coffee already brewing, set on a timer, because I had thought ahead. I always do. On the marble island was a stack of envelopes, cards from guests, receipts from vendors, one note in my mother's handwriting that I hadn't opened yet. I placed them all aside. What caught my attention was the leather-bound document folder resting where I had left it the night before, marked with a gold-embossed tab. Name change, documents rejected. It wasn't an act of defiance, not really, it was clarity. Everyone had assumed I would take his name, just like everyone had assumed he was the one funding the wedding, just like they assumed I'd be the wife of, from this point forward. But what they failed to notice, what they always failed to notice, was that I had spent over a decade building a name before I ever met Daniel. It was on contracts, on filings, on design boards, on the copyright of everything one had created. It was in every client referral, every article, every keynote invitation. My name wasn't something I wore, it was something I earned. It wasn't about ego, it was about roots, and I wasn't going to dig them up just to plant them in someone else's garden. During the rehearsal dinner, one of Daniel's uncles, harmless but loud, raised his glass and joked, "Here's to the future, Mrs. Anderson." I had smiled then, politely, but inside, a line drew itself. Not a hard, jagged one, just a clear, permanent mark that said, "No, actually, here's to the woman who made space for someone else in her already built life, not the other way around." The morning sun crept in, warming the floor, stretching toward the corners of the kitchen. I sipped coffee, phone in hand, rereading the confirmation email from the registrar. Marriage certificate issued in the name of Olivia Hart. Just like every LLC, every studio door, every branded package and investor deck. My name. Not because it was better, but because it was mine. Daniel understood, even if others didn't. When we first discussed it, he simply said, "Of course you're keeping your name. It's who you are. No insecurity, no passive aggression, no jokes. Just knowing." That's what I loved about him. He didn't need to be seen through me. He didn't want to reshape me. We walked beside each other, not one in front of the other. Later that morning, when guests trickled in for the farewell brunch, the hotel staff handed out printed menus with the title, Hart and Anderson, Brunch Selections. But the billing? The suite? The signature on the event contract? All under Hart. And when the photographer sent the first preview shots to my business email, it was addressed to Ms. Olivia Hart, not out of oversight, but out of instruction. The older women noticed. Some smiled in approval, others whispered to each other, their voices low but sharp. One aunt even commented that it was, quote, unusual for a woman to assert her name so publicly. "Maybe in Hollywood," she said. I didn't respond. I didn't correct or explain. I just nodded and let her stew in her assumptions. Because this time, I wasn't shrinking for comfort. I wasn't softening so people wouldn't trip over their expectations. This time, I stood in my space, quietly, confidently, fully. Before we left the hotel, I walked back into the ballroom one last time. Empty now, but the echoes were still there. The laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses, the gasps when the curtains lifted and the city skyline appeared behind us. There was still the faintest trace of perfume in the air. My shoes tapped softly across the wood floor as I made my way to the center, standing right beneath the chandelier. I imagined every person who had told me, in one way or another, to tone it down, to marry up, to trade power for softness, to blend. And I imagined them seeing this room, this marriage, this moment, and realizing I hadn't disappeared. I hadn't been swallowed by someone else's story. I had invited someone into mine. My name was never the point of debate. It was the signature on the story. And now it was the name over the threshold. The name on the studio door. The name I would one day pass on if I chose to. Not because I was afraid to change, but because I already had into someone I was finally proud of. I stood still for another second, then turned, heels echoing in a rhythm that was entirely mine.